I come from a quaint little town in Australia that most tourists would regard as picturesque. We get our fair share of tourists throughout the year as they love to wander the walking trails that crisscross the outskirts. From the outside, our town would be regarded as perfect, but we hide a dark secret that only the inhabitants know about. I learned about the secret during my first driving lesson with my mum. I was beyond stressed that morning, as my mother is a perfectionist and I did not want to disappoint her. We started off slowly as she taught me to drive down the narrow roadways. My hands had a vice-like grip on the steering wheel, as I was paranoid that I was going to make even a single mistake. I kept glancing at my mother out of the corner of my eye to judge her reaction to my driving. We were driving almost half an hour when I looked into the rearview mirror and spotted the smiling man sitting in the back seat. I was so shocked that I almost spun the steering wheel and crashed into a ditch. My mother screamed at me to keep driving, and whatever I do not turn around. My eyes were fixated on the mirror as I stared at the man who had suddenly appeared in our back seat. His face was somehow clouded in shadow, even though it was a beautiful sunny day outside. The only features of his face that I could even make out were his eyes, which were sickly green. His mouth was twisted into a snarling smile. It made me want to jump out of the car. I watched in horror as he started reaching forward with his long, spindly arms towards me. I was paying so much attention to him that I had taken my feet off the gas pedal and we were slowing down. My mother slapped me across the face and yelled at me to drive faster. I sped up and I watched in relief as his arms slowly withdrew back towards his body. He leaned his head forward and he opened his mouth. A plethora of voices began pleading for help. I instinctively covered my ears with my hands, which forced my mother to grab the steering wheel. It took me a few seconds to regain my composure, and I grabbed the steering wheel again. My entire body was on edge as these cries coming from his mouth reached a deafening crescendo. In the blink of an eye, the smiling man vanished, leaving me and my mother alone in the car. I pulled off the road and proceeded to vomit out my breakfast. The local police officer drove by and stopped to see what was wrong. He gave me a nod of approval as my mother explained that we had an extra guest in our back seat. We drove home in silence, and I tried to venture the subject with her on a number of occasions, but she refused to talk about it. I learned from a few other people that he has been appearing in cars for almost 70 years. No one knows anything about him, but they all warned me to never turn to face him. I moved away to college a few months afterwards, and over time, I forgot about that smiling man. I started dating a girl that I met in my history class. We were both a bit shy, so no one knew that we were actually a couple. It started getting serious with her, so I decided to bring her home to meet my mother. I was a bit nervous about how she would react to him. We were just driving into the town when I spotted the smiling man, once again, sitting in my back seat. The blood drained from my face as we locked eyes in the mirror. My girlfriend suddenly jumped in her seat as she must have noticed the smiling man. I shouted at her not to turn around, but it was already too late. The smiling man's grin widened as she turned in her chair to look at him. There was a blinding flash that caused me to jam on the brakes. I was suddenly drenched in blood and body parts as my girlfriend's body exploded. I climbed out of the car and onto the road, weeping as her body flowed out of the car and pooled on the ground. I was discovered by the same officer who tried his best to comfort me. It took me almost 2 weeks to get myself cleaned up, as I kept on finding pieces of her in my hair. I went back to college almost 3 months later, and I felt my heart drop as I spotted posters of her hanging everywhere. A woman saw me looking at them and asked me for help locating her missing daughter. I excused myself and practically ran away. I didn't have the heart to tell her that her daughter is buried in a small field in the middle of nowhere.